Alright, hello and welcome to my presentation. My presentation today is going to be on problem-based learning with students with learning disabilities. And through this presentation I hope to define problem-based learning, the meaning of learning, and other important skills students learn through their time in the classroom. I'm also going to outline some benefits and challenges of problem-based learning in a general education classroom and a special education or mainstream classroom. And I'm also going to define some different strategies that can help students with learning disabilities succeed in a problem-based learning classroom. So what is problem-based learning? Problem-based learning has gone by many names, such as inquiry, project-based learning, discovery learning, and constructivism. Proponents of problem-based learning insist that it engages students and allows students ownership to their own learning and helps learning be constructed in the student's mind as they build their own information. Problem-based learning is not a new concept. It's been around since the early 1950s. So the real definition of problem-based learning is that it's experiential in any way that the teacher deems fit, so the student experiences their learning rather than being told. The most basic way to break down problem-based learning is into these three steps. So first, the student or teacher defines the big question to be answered, and that's the question that all of the following classes will focus on answering. Students will, with differing amounts of supports from the teacher, take a look at the question and develop a plan for how they will answer the question. So they could do this by researching it, doing an experiment, creating models, or finding patterns. Students then use the information they have found to answer the question. Depending on the outcome the teacher wishes to achieve, the big question could be many different things, including case studies or lab activities, problem-solving questions, or web quests. So in order to determine whether problem-based learning is an effective teaching strategy, we need to define what learning is. So learning can most simply be defined as a change in long-term memory. And in order to change long-term memory, 3 steps need to happen. So the brain must recognize stimulus in its short-term memory, and short-term memory is usually just a few bits of information, usually around 7, but as low as 3 or 4. That information enters the short-term memory, and the brain decides whether or not to dismiss it or act on it. If the brain decides to act on it, it then becomes working memory. And working memory helps you kind of remember where you're going, what you're doing. If you forget something, if you forget what you're going into a room to grab, that's a fault in your working memory. And So after something has been repeated many times and the findings have been consistent, that data then enters your long-term memory. So for example, after many exposures of the answer to the question of 3 times 5 being 15, after many exposures to that, a student will become familiar with it, it will stick in that long-term memory, and the student will no longer have to think about what 3 times 5 is. They'll just know 3 times 5 is 15. Another place that problem-based learning helps students learn is in their social skills. Students who have difficulties with social issues tend to have difficulties working in groups or making connections with other students and understanding those social cues. But working in a fairly structured setting can help students learn positive social skills. Having some structure means that students who have issues with social skills don't have to rely so much on understanding their own social skills because they have that structure to fall back on. Problem-based learning, under its many names, is a teaching strategy that many school divisions in the province have adopted. And because of this, we have to assume that there are some positives. And these are some of the positives that I found. Students become better problem solvers. Students get to work in real-world situations. The students are engaged. The students are moving and doing work around the classrooms. Student groups help students socialize. And students gain a better understanding of the meaning of their information. So not just that 3 times 5 is 15, but when you have 3 groups of 5 things, you have 15 things. Many of the studies that have been written about problem-based learning use students who are above average or gifted. These are a lot of the studies which school divisions are using to support the need for problem-based learning. Because of this, we must think of our students with learning disabilities and try and decide if there are any places where they may be at a deficit when using problem-based learning. So problem-based learning is very taxing on working memory, which means long-term memory may not be altered. It also means that students may miss steps or forget where they're going if their working memory isn't as strong as an average student's. This could be very frustrating as students try and work through a problem and can't quite get to the end. Students with learning gaps don't have the prior knowledge necessary to draw on to decide what will happen next in their plan. So if you're doing a problem and you have to figure out, let's say, the net income of someone, you not only have to remember that you're multiplying the hours to figure out their gross, then you have to remember to multiply a percent, which means you have to convert that percent into a decimal. Then you have to try and remember what you're multiplying that percent by, and that can just become very confusing if you don't know the steps right offhand. Also, students with low self-confidence when it comes to their schoolwork may not be willing to take as many risks necessary to be successful in a problem-based learning situation. Problem-based learning does require students to take a lot of risks as they don't see the answer right there. They're trying to construct that answer, and that can be, it's a big risk for them to put something on paper that could be wrong. So through my research, I came across many strategies that can help you use problem-based learning. And these strategies will not only help students with learning disabilities, but will also help students, regular students, who may just need a little push in the right direction. So these include, but aren't limited to, general education teachers and special education teachers conferring with each other about planning, scaffolding, group work, guided instruction, worked examples, process worksheets, timely feedback, and differentiation. So in collaboration between general education teacher and special education teachers, this will help those few students within a general education classroom who may need a little bit of extra help. So usually what happens is the general education teacher will create the problem-based learning project and make sure that it's meeting all those curricular outcomes necessary. And then he or she will meet with the special education teacher, and that teacher will help them develop any extra materials which a student with learning disabilities may need to successfully complete the project so that everyone in the room can be successful. So scaffolding. Scaffolding is where a teacher gives students kind of exactly like a scaffold. So if you think about a scaffold on a building, it helps the worker get up to the level that they need to get. A scaffolding in a classroom will give students the hints, the clues, some of the information they need to get from that ground level up to where they need to be. Scaffolding should eventually be taken down once the student is up to a level that no longer requires the scaffolding. There are 2 different types of scaffolding. Soft scaffolding, which is just an individual response to a student. So if you notice a student is struggling, you could give them some one-on-one tutoring, some feedback on their daily assignments, or interviews with each of your students to be sure that they are understanding the project. Then we have hard scaffolding, which is given to all students. So examples of this would be worksheets that kind of help them through the process, or mini lectures daily that give them just that little bit of information they need to move on to the next step. So group work is very important in the social aspect of project-based learning. So if the group is selected properly, it can benefit all of the students. If groups are chosen successfully, students are able to fill gaps that other students may have, and that creates a sense of success for all students involved. So if student A has problems verbalizing what she wants the rest of her group to do, maybe student B is able to take what she's asking and put it in language that is more accessible to the rest of the group. And then those two students are working in a relationship that helps the entire group. So guided instruction is used by teachers to make sure that students have the information to meet their daily objectives. So that could be a mini lesson every day, maybe worksheets, writing your goals on the board to be sure students know exactly where they're going and how they may be able to get where they need to be by the end of class. So a worked example is a great way to give students sort of a visual on how the example or how the rest of the questions they're going to do work. So this could be left on a board or given in notes or in a textbook, or even on a card that a student could get if they're having trouble with a specific area. So the problems that you do in a worked example are going to be similar to the problems that are on the assignment, and it helps reduce the workload of the working memory and help the long-term memory process and remember more data, thereby increasing the learning. So if the working memory isn't working on trying to remember what the next step is, but trying to remember how this step works and work through it, then it's a little less taxed and is able to get through the steps quicker so the long-term memory can gain that information. I have seen teachers use worked examples on the sides of tests to give some of their students just a way of using the example, and that's a great way to help students through a test where you may not be necessarily testing them on knowing exactly what the steps are, but knowing how to use those steps. So process worksheet is very similar to a worked example, but it writes out in a little more detail exactly what the steps are. So the picture here is an example of a process worksheet that I've given to my students, and it guides them through the use of trigonometry and how to figure out the answer to a question. My students were then able to use this worksheet to do the rest of their assignment. So I gave them 3 of these because there's 3 different possibilities that you might encounter when solving trigonometry problems. And each one of the worksheets had a different process on it. And then they had to set up the question, decide which process they were going to use, and then they had the steps to follow in order to get to the answer. And this helps students practice their new knowledge and commit it to long-term memory without using up all that working memory that is sometimes difficult to use if you don't have as much as another. So timely feedback is really important for all students and for all assignments, but especially in problem-based learning, timely feedback can give students the next steps they need to follow. So in some of the papers I read, they talked about how teachers would take in daily assignments and give feedback on them, and this would they would give students the next steps for what they were to do in the project. So if they were noticing that students were missing some research in a certain area, they could give students websites to find or search topics that they could search to see if they could find more of the information. It also gives students gives them the information they need if they're missing something, if they're on the right track, and how to get back on track if they're not on track. And finally, differentiation. So differentiation gives students who are missing those gaps the ability to fill the gaps in order to meet the project. So in our math at my school this coming year, grades 8 to 12 will be working on some differentiation before they start the units. So if we'll test, and if a student, say, has issues with multiplication, they will work on their multiplication facts, and then when we get to the unit, their multiplication facts will be more in their long-term memory. They won't have to work with their working memory to figure out what the answer to that question is, and then they'll be able to learn the information that I want them to learn rather than having to worry about the multiplication in the questions. So in conclusion, problem-based learning is very beneficial in many ways, but it can't be the only teaching strategy relied upon. Teachers must use many different methods of getting information for their students so that they can take that information they get from the teacher and apply it to their projects. In order to effectively use problem-based learning, teachers must use scaffolding to be sure that their students are getting the information and are able to build on that information. And there's many, many ways that you can get information to students and scaffold it for them. Teachers should be sure to involve their special education teacher in the development of problem-based learning opportunities. So this PowerPoint and video is especially important for special education teachers because it gives them a way to help their general education teachers make sure that their special education students' needs are met and they're able to get as much as possible out of their learning. So thank you very much for watching my video. I'm going to let my resources sit on the screen for a little bit so that you can see what I read.